to welcome you to the fourth speaker in our Scholar Series regarding the Native American Indigenous Studies program under development at Heritage here for the past 4 years now. We're excited that Dr. Kim Christen is with us. Prior we've had Dr. Chad Hamill from Northern Arizona University, Dr. Kate Shanley from University of Montana, Dr. Noemi Solorzano Thompson from Westminster College in Utah, and so now we have Dr. Kim Christen from Washington State University. The purpose of this program is to develop 4 key courses in the Native American Indigenous Studies major that really speak to both our populations in the sense of pre-contact histories, in the sense of ongoing contemporary issues, in the sense of identity. And the goal of the course as it relates to the Columbia Plateau region is that we are intent on developing a curriculum that has a tribal specificity. We're going to deal with patriarchal, matriarchal presentations of identity, creation stories, bloodlines, tribal government, community reservation and imaginary imposed boundaries, ceremony, sustainability, preservation of traditions. And then we want a regional consciousness that moves beyond our particular local community into the Pacific Northwest region and deals with sovereignty and other issues that come up for Native people every day. Then beyond that, an Indian country sensibility where we are the models and pilot this program across the country for other people to follow, an intergenerational connection with curriculum. Also a curriculum that really stresses research that's connected to the community, and also internships that are meaningful as far as bringing information from the community and Indigenous knowledge back into the curriculum in the classroom. So in that way, we are so happy to have Dr. Kim Christen from Washington State University. She is part of our Somos Indios, we are Indian, Bridging Indigenous Identities program. She's associate professor at Washington State with the Department of English and Digital Technology Cultural Programs. She's a director of digital project at the Columbia Plateau Center for American Indian Studies. And she is our speaker today, and she has many projects around the globe that she will reference and talk about. And we're happy to have her specifically because she really embodies the idea of transformational research as research that has the capacity to revolutionize existing fields, create new subfields, cause paradigm shifts, support discovery, and lead to radically new technologies. She will be developing curriculum along with our faculty for the new course in digital heritage and the ethics of sharing Indigenous knowledge. And so thank you so much for coming. I'd like Kim Christen to approach the platform and share with us her heart and her work.
Well, thank you for coming, and I want to thank Winona for inviting me, and Mary and all of you for being such gracious hosts. It was wonderful yesterday to be part of this dialogue and conversation about a class to be produced called Digital Heritage and the Ethics of Information Sharing. It's something that's near and dear to my heart, and I wish we had a class like that at WSU, so I'm happy to see it be developed here at Heritage, and I'm really happy to be part of helping that conversation go on. And so, as Winona said, I'm going to talk about my work today and how it relates to these sort of overarching issues that will stem through the program that you're building here and hopefully spark some ideas and conversations. So this idea of Indigenous cultural heritage, digital heritage, and the ethics of information sharing is sort of a really big topic, and it has a lot of moving parts. So I want to focus today on a notion of digital return. And I've started to think of digital return as something much more than the digitization and exchange of materials. Now that's pretty straightforward. It's a technological project. You can digitize something and give it back to somebody or give it to somebody, and that's fine. But I'm using digital return as this sort of umbrella term to include many types of return practices. But specifically in this case, as it relates to Indigenous cultural heritage materials, I'm really, and ones that are found within collecting institutions, libraries, museums, and archives nationally, regionally, locally, I'm really talking about digital repatriation. Now, I use that term repatriation very consciously, very purposely, to denote a set of political and cultural practices, okay, that these go further than the idea of just digitizing materials and giving them back to the source communities. So repatriation is something that when we add it on to the digital, it's signaling something that's beyond the digital. It's signaling something that is political, it is social, it is cultural, and it is linked to the physical repatriation of native cultural materials. In the United States and Canada specifically, but in most settler nations, repatriation is a political act that recognizes the injustices of colonial endeavors and promotes a process that values indigenous social systems and cultural protocols concerning the handling of human remains and sacred objects. That's what, when these types of repatriation and return projects happen, they're very meaningful to communities. So digital repatriation is then, stemming from this, a process of returning digital materials that takes seriously that already existing ethical system of knowledge circulation and sociality within indigenous communities. So it's saying there's already a way of handling this circulation within indigenous communities. We need to be mindful of that. So that's why it's not just giving back. It's giving back in a way that makes sense to the community and honors those ethical systems that are already happening. And most importantly, for digital return, it understands that for many indigenous communities around the world, there are cultural protocols around not seeing. That is, as most of you well know here, indigenous knowledge systems have varied types of access to both tangible and intangible materials. So the tangible things that we can actually see in a physical repatriation, as well as that intangible knowledge. Not everything is meant to be seen or known by everybody. So what we know is from the last 15 years or so is that digital materials can and often do have similar political, emotional, and cultural effects as the return of physical objects. That is, the return of digital collections can forge new local processes and practices that provide the seeds for linguistic revitalization. So we have old tapes that have been digitized of last speakers of a language, or songs that aren't sung anymore, or old grammars from missionaries and linguists that are on the shelves somewhere in the basement of the Library of Congress. When those get digitized and returned to a community who's interested in revitalization, those can be key, along with cultural production, intergenerational knowledge transfer. This is key for digital repatriation. These things go back, elders have access to them, and they spark conversations. They spark conversations with other generations within the community. Things that they may have thought were lost are brought back. You can never forget that colonial history of how because they didn't get lost. They got stolen, right? They got taken in oftentimes violent and really oppressive ways. And so this digital return has to be mindful of that. We can't erase and wash over it. We need to remember that it's there and be very respectful of that. So this is not a technologically determinist argument. I'm not making a pitch for technology as a savior. I see these types of headlines all the time, and they grab attention, iPhone apps to save endangered languages. No iPhone and no iPad is going to save endangered languages. Only the people who speak the languages are going to do that. Those are tools, and they will help, and kids will be interested, but if there's nobody there for them to hear the language or sit down with them and do it, it's not going to happen. So be weary of those of those fancy headlines. Oh, Microsoft, it's great that Microsoft's operating system is in Cherokee. That's fantastic. But the Cherokee Nation has pushed that for 15 years tirelessly to get that to happen. That's the only reason. It's not from Microsoft. I mean, it's glad that they did it. Good for them. But they didn't do it on their own behalf. So it's the people behind it. So the point here for me is that local projects and local needs inform the best uses of technology. We can't go top down. We need to go bottom up. What do communities want technology for? What are their goals? Is a certain type of technology the best way to get there? So one example I want to talk about today is the Plateau People's Web Portal. This is a project that I direct through WSU, and it's a collaboratively curated and reciprocally managed online portal of Plateau people's cultural materials from the WSU libraries, all of the libraries across campus, the Northwest Museum of Art and Culture in Spokane, the National Anthropological Archives, and the National Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian have all donated digital collections to the Plateau People's Web Portal. Now, what's significant and what I start with about the portal is that it grew out of the expressed needs of the tribal nations with whom WSU holds a memorandum of understanding. WSU holds a memorandum of understanding with 11 tribes. Presently, 5 of the tribes, the Coeur d'Alene, Spokane, Colville, Umatilla, as well as the Yakama Nation, are part of the Plateau People's Web Portal. These tribal members approached the Plateau Center for American Indian Studies at WSU prior to when I was there. When I came in, this had already been started. But they approached the Plateau Center for American Indian Studies and said, okay, this is what we want. What we want is access to the materials that are in your library collections for our community members that can't get to Pullman. So we're dispersed across 3 states, we're all around here, we have people at different levels of access. How can they best make use of this material? So, but what's really important is they said we don't just want access, because that would be great, but that's that, sort of let's digitize it and throw it up online model. And that works for some, but not in this case. So importantly, they wanted some control over the way their cultural materials were managed, narrated, and curated online to align with their own ethical knowledge systems. So this wasn't going to be just a digitization project. In fact, the digitization end of it didn't happen until the 3rd year of the project, okay? So to this end, we worked together both technically and philosophically to make Indigenous knowledge central to every single aspect of the portal. That was my goal. That was the goal of the tribal representatives from the 5 nations that we worked with. And we had fantastic and fabulous meetings, and I sort of missed those early days. They were really exciting. But during that time, we sought to strike a balance between the informational needs, sovereign rights, and ethical concerns of the tribes and the professional concerns and institutional standards of librarians, archivists, and other information specialists. And this was really key. Nobody, including the tribal representatives, said, hey, we want to throw out all that knowledge that has been gathered by experts. What we're saying is, hey, we're experts. Hello, we're experts, right? This is our knowledge, our material. It's great that there is some data and metadata about that. And I remember at one point, Melissa Minthorn-Winks from Temuscalit, from Umatilla, said, that's fine. We don't want to throw that stuff out. We want our say. And that was sort of our guiding principle. How do we put those 2 things together, not tear them apart? How do we put them together and just allow them to be, even if they're in tension, like Winona was saying yesterday, sometimes they might be in tension. Let's see what that looks like. So rather than rely on technological narratives that demand ever faster routes of information circulation and a digital default that's set to open for all cultural materials, right? We had to stop and put those things on hold. And this is really a sticking point for some librarians, archivists, and museum specialists because their training is to make things open to the public. That's the fantastic thing about libraries. It's great, so don't get me wrong. All for public access to the infrastructure, to the library, but not all content should be open in the same way because that's a cultural value. Okay, so knowledge is part of a culture, many different cultures, many different sets of knowledge values, and that was key. And I have to say right off the bat that our librarians at Washington State University, Trevor Bond, Cheryl Gunselman, Alex Merrill, were never up against us. They said, yes, we want to do it this way. How are we going to do it? So they have been fantastic. So a lot of this is that the portal, we start from a position that recognizes and respects the fact that many Indigenous systems of knowledge management, again, start from that place of not seeing. And how do you do that in a library or a museum whose goal is to have exhibits for you to see? How do we do that? This is one of my favorite images. This is from Central Australia where I work. I've done a lot of my research. And the great thing about Central Australia, when you go to a lot of the cultural centers there, I was struck the first time I saw something like this. And I went and I asked, and this isn't an image from Uluru, but this is farther north where I work in Tennant Creek. But when I was at Uluru, Ayers Rock, when I was at Uluru in the early 2000s, I saw this duct tape, this over like 2 or 3 pictures, and then I saw a piece of cardboard stripped on one, and then blacked out with spray paint. I was like, what is going on here in a museum? And they said, yeah, one of the elders died last week, and those were the pictures. Community members came in and did that. I mean, I worked with a visual architect at the Ninkanunu Art and Culture Center in Tennant Creek on this, and she was just out of her mind that this would happen, that they would come and disrupt these beautiful displays, right? They would come and disrupt these beautiful displays. It's like, it's for the community. It's the community's display, and this is actually adding value, in my opinion, to the display. We're learning something else by looking at this display and say, what's going on? So we have to ask the question, what is going on? Why can't we see this? Because in our culture, we don't look at images of people once they've passed away. That's why there's masking tape over it. And so you start that conversation. All the songs that those people sang, they go away. They come back. In Australia, they're redreamed. Different communities have different ways of doing it. So for the portal, when we were doing the portal, I brought some of my experience from Australia to the table, but I didn't presume that the Plateau peoples would be the same. So we started our workflow process by asking tribal representatives what they want digitized. We never digitize without permission, ever, 0, don't. Who they wanted to see what we digitized, how it should be described, and why it was significant to them. So that's why I said these were the conversations that we had for several years. And in our first iteration of the portal that went up in 2010, there were only 100 items. I said that once at a public lecture at the SAA, the Society for American Archivists, and the whole room just went, because to put 100 digital items up, I mean, I could do that right now on Dropbox, and it would take me like a minute, right? Why did it take us 2 years? Because we're upending a whole paradigm. Archives have historically been places where Indigenous peoples have been spoken about, right? You get little, the tagline on this is, naked young woman holding a bowl with a tall cone of fragment ointment. Descriptive, it's descriptive, right? But that's it. So our project begins with switching that equation. We bring Native community members into the archives. This was from a trip to the Northwest Museum of Art and Culture in Spokane in October for a kickoff for our new NEH grant that is digitizing the materials at the MAC to be part of the portal. And so we've had the grant for a year and a half. Guess how many items we've digitized? 0, none, because we're still in the consultation phase. People have to come in and see this stuff. And I just love this picture because this was it's blurry because it's from my phone, because it was in no way staged. This was a photo that she'd never seen before of relatives. That's what this is all about. If that image never gets digitized, it doesn't matter. We've already won. Okay, so at every stage of the project, from the technical to the curatorial, decisions are made by tribal representatives in consultation with the wonderful librarians at WSU, myself, and the Plateau Center. So it's not like we do the technology and they do the cultural. We all do it together. So the portal begins with a recognition of both the sovereignty of each tribe as well as what unites them across time and space. This was really interesting. So the top image there is of the Columbia River. And so we had a whole conversation with the tribal representatives, how are we going to represent, because this could grow. I always said from the beginning, like all 11 MOU tribes can be part of this. We're starting with 3 and now we're up to 5. It's going to go slowly over time. So what do we do to create something that's representative of all the tribes, but that also signals, hey, we're also sovereign nations? So it was great that what the tribal representative said, well, you know what? The Columbia River is the thread that unites us. So the Columbia River signals up here, hey, we're all Plateau peoples. Then each tribe has their own tribal path. So that's where you'll see here. Yakima, Umatilla, Coeur d'Alene, as I said, we've added and it'll keep going on. So you see the Columbia River, you see Plateau peoples, we're united, but we're also individual sovereign nations and tribes. And so you can go in and you could just look at stuff from the Yakima Nation if that is what you want. Or you can search across and see things from all of the tribes. And you can do multiple types of searches and all that kind of stuff. But so the public face of the portal reflects this sort of collaborative nature of the tribes. Another second interesting part that took months, was one of my favorite things that I always like to talk about, are the 12 categories that we have. Now, this was key because we did not want to recreate the sort of colonial terminology of the Library of Congress subject headings, for which we could have chosen Indians or Northwest Indians. So we would have had 2 subject headings. Okay? So we thought, well, maybe not so much. I actually said that at the Library of Congress once. But I will tell you, they're okay with it. We do use, if there's librarians in here, don't get hives. We do use the Library of Congress subject headings. Our librarians at WSU, everybody's breathing, nobody's dying. We do have the Library of Congress subject headings in there. However, they are in no way primary. What is primary, and on the main page, are the 12 categories that the tribes chose. How do you want to represent, how do you think about these materials? We might have a category called religion that doesn't work for you. We might have a category called Indians that doesn't work for you. What are your categories? So again, we started and we said, okay, but we have these major categories and we can have as many as we want. We actually started with 9, and then a year ago we added 3 because after a year and a half of use, 2 of the tribal groups said, hey, you know, we really need this and we really need that, so we added it. Technologically, it's super easy to add categories to the portal. That's not the issue. So we sat down with yellow legal pads and lots of coffee and food over a few days and sketched ideas and emails back and forth. This process took over 6 months to come up with 9. The first 9 categories, because the tribal representatives were very sensitive to the fact that they had to, again, work across Plateau. So nobody wanted to alienate any of the other tribes. So the second thing that we came up with is that while all the material can be tagged with any of the 12 categories, and multiple, you could have something that is literally tagged with all 12, although I wouldn't, for searching and browsing purposes, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you wanted to, you could. But you could have education and ceremony, let's say, on one tag. Once you get in there, the way that we technologically dealt with the cultural issue of having different sovereign nations, having different understandings of these categories, any tribe can add subcategories of their own. So within religion, for example, Umatilla have added boarding schools. Now, some of the other tribes might want to use that. They might not. They might want to call it something else. Okay, and under lands, the Coeur d'Alene have all kinds of names for their reservation lands. So each of the tribes determines the subcategories on their own. And what's really cool technologically is that they can do that on the fly. They type it in, it happens, boom, hit go, it's already there. So they don't have to wait for anybody. We're not correcting their spelling. It's theirs. They own it. They can also change it at any time they want. Okay? Now, in terms of that, these are the tribal representatives who have this sort of administrative capabilities. So when a user comes to the portal, if you go to the portal, you're going to view some records, a catalog record. And you'll find that standard metadata hasn't gone anywhere. Everybody's safe. The standard metadata is there. The title of this image is from the McWhorter collection. Probably a lot of you here have heard of the McWhorter collection. And the title is 3 Yakima Women, which it could have been worse. It could have been derogatory. It could have been a lot worse. But it's still not that great, right? 3 Yakima Women. But prior to the Plateau People's Web Portal, if anybody came across this image, this is what they would know about it. They would know the title, 3 Yakima Women, the creator, McWhorter, and a description, which reads, a photo of 3 Yakima women in regalia, okay? And you would know it's from 1911. So, you know, you're not without knowledge. You would get some knowledge. However, once we returned this image and the Yakima community said, yes, we want this, we send it back, and they add tribal knowledge. So the tribal representatives, we worked at first with the library, with Vivian Adams from the library, Jolena Tilliquetz from the library, in this first phase of the portal. The knowledge that was added now for this, we have a whole cultural narrative over here that tells us who these women were. Jolena said, hey, I know that. It's my grandma. So now we don't have 3 Yakima women. We know who they are. We have this whole narrative over here. And then Vivian came in and said, oh, this stuff actually relates to ceremony. Like, in fact, Vivian wrote like a dissertation. So I can't even fit it all on one slide. There are like 10 paragraphs. Now, the really interesting thing is that also, and sorry, that's over there, is that you have these different levels of users. So, well, let me go back to this. So we have this. So the question becomes, here's the public view. You're getting all of this, right? How does all of this happen? How are the tribes actually empowered to do this? So within the portal, there's different levels of access. There's a general user. So any of you can just go on and be a general user. There's community users, there's scholars, there's tribal admins, institutional admins, and my favorite category, super admin. Now we discussed this with the tribes, and this was something at length. There are cultural protocols in place. However, from a technological perspective, somebody has to be able to see all that. If they're going to make changes to code or to other things, unfortunately, they might come across that. So what are we going to do? So we have this super admin who has sort of control over the whole system. Our super admin is Alex Merrill, our Director of Digital Initiatives at the Washington State University Libraries. And after meeting with Alex, the tribal representatives decided we trust Alex. So our agreement is that anytime whoever is going to be that super admin will have a conversation with the tribal representatives. So it's not a nameless, faceless super admin. It's Alex. And we trust Alex enough to know that he's not going to go snooping around in there. Okay, so again, it's technological, but it comes back to trust. The tribal admins are decided by the tribes. So again, we started out with the tribal representatives who were already working with the Plateau Center for American Indian Studies at WSU. This is not in any way set in stone, and for the Yakima Nation, there can be other tribal representatives added at any time. So the tribal admins are the folks within the tribe, at this point, Vivian and Jolena, the folks at the library, have the ability to upload content, to add those cultural narratives, okay? The key point here, let me see, is that you have the tribal admins and they have that power. The institutional admins, I'm an institutional administrator for WSU's side. So I can go in and change and add metadata and narratives only from the institutional record. Remember when I showed you the record? So I can access what's called the catalog record. I cannot access what's called the tribal catalog record or the tribal knowledge. I literally cannot access it with my password. But they can't access the institutional. That was our give and take. Okay, so we'll put up the institutional stuff, such as it is. You add yours, it will sit side by side, and any viewer can just see both. It's just both there. And so what's key here is that we have this sort of flow and curation is about that balance that I talked about at the beginning. So for the tribes, what's interesting is that for your own content, so that slide from WSU was a WSU owned, it came from the WSU collection. Tribes, you can upload your own content. So collections from your museum, from your archive, from your library can be added. You can add whatever categories you want, and here you see the subcategories. So this was a picture that Jolena uploaded about an event from 2005 from the Yakima Youth Camp. So under Lifeways, there's now a subcategory called Youth Camp, and under Lands, there's a subcategory called Camp Chaparral. okay? Very specific. That's what she wanted. She added that, boom, it was there. You can also add anything to a map. You add the tribal catalog record, you add the tribal knowledge, you can add people's names. So never again do we have to have 3 Yakima women. You can name the people within there. And then add the cultural narrative over here. All of this happens at the back end. As a front viewer, you would never see this. This is once you log on with your administrative password. Okay, you do this. But most importantly for your content as a tribe, you get to add cultural protocols. The protocols that were decided on by the tribal representatives from the beginning, and just like the categories, we can add as many as we want. The protocols that we have now are male only, female only, elder only, or children may not view. That's the only one that's negative. And then, key for the tribal representatives was that we had tribal restrictions. So you can have it, you can have it open to all of the tribes. So again, this is not open to the general public. For this restriction, it's open to all of the tribes, right? Open to certain affiliated tribes. So say for Yakima, you want to upload something and only share it with Umatilla. You just check Yakima and Umatilla. Or if you want to do all affiliated tribes, you can have all 5, or you can say, no, only members of my tribe. Okay, and within that, if you have only members of my tribe and you check male elders, guess what? If there's a female elder who logs on, she won't see that. Or if you have elders only from only your tribe, and anybody who's not designated an elder, and that happens in their user profile, they won't be able to see it. So that's, again, back to the community defining. So to get a username and password, they have to go into the library or go into the museum or go wherever it is and sit down and talk with somebody and say, I want a username and password so that I can do this, and then you have a conversation about that. And we leave that up to the tribes completely. That's the other nice thing about this. WSU has Yakima Nation is a sovereign nation. Nations get to decide how that happens. And the different ones do it differently. For Umatilla, I know you can just call to Musculate and say, hey, and then they'll talk to you. And so everybody does it differently. What we see here, though, once you get the full record, now you see the map, now you see the catalog record. Again, they're too long. I can't put them all on one slide, unfortunately. But you get this sense of layered knowledge. No longer is it expert knowledge that's delineated by certain fields. We have this layered knowledge. So far from closing off or diminishing the public domain, as some critics of Indigenous curation have assumed, the portal, in my estimation, actually enlivens the public record with the Indigenous voices that had previously been erased or marginalized. So rather than buy into the hype about the wisdom of crowds, we rely on the local experts to enrich the already public record. And then that goes back to what Melissa said. You've already had your say. These are already out there. There's no use taking it down now. For these, I'm sure there are certain sacred things that actually, people would want to be taken down. But these, what we deal with in the portal, it's like they're already out there. What do we do with them? So the aim of the portal and its architecture, its workflow, our philosophy, everything, is to empower the ethical exchange of knowledge. It's not just knowledge exchange, the ethical exchange of knowledge between multiple publics, many different stakeholders who want their voices heard. We've done this by creating a tool that can be mobilized in service of culturally driven knowledge management systems. But that's based on creating relationships of respect. The tool cannot exist apart from that, in my estimation. The relationships of respect between Native nations and the libraries, universities, and archives that hold these materials are key. That's why we begin with years of consultation first before we move to the next step. The need for these type of tools is not particular to the Plateau region, which is why over the last 2 years I've worked with a range of collaborators to scale up the portal's technological platform. We've created Mukadu. Mukadu is a free and open source content management system built from the ground up with these needs in mind. So how do we make protocols? How do we make layered knowledge? How do we do all of this? So Mukadu is actually a Warramungu word. The Warramungu people live in the central desert of Australia, and I started working with them in 1995 as bright-eyed graduate student with a master's student at the time. And by 2002, they were opening up their own cultural center, the Ninkanunu Art and Cultural Center. And part of that was to have an archive. And we looked all over high and low and couldn't find any type of cultural content management system that dealt with these type of issues of protocols. But the women can't see that. It's men's business. But you're not from that place. They can't see that. What do we do? And because I was 23 and naive, I said, oh, it's easy. We can figure that out. So, it's not been so easy, but we figured it out. So, Mukadu was named because Mukadu is a word that actually literally means in Waramungu, dilly bag. And I had never heard the word before, and I was speaking to one of the elders, Michael Jumbin Jones, and a fluent speaker of Waramungu. And he said, I think we should call that Mukadu. And I said, Jumbin, I've never heard that word before. And he said, it's that dilly bag. Remember, we saw it at the museum in South Australia. And I was like, I do remember seeing that. Well, why should we call the archive Mukadu then if it's a dilly bag? So that dilly bag is a safe keeping place. Elders put sacred items in there, but they couldn't just keep them in there. When the young fellas came to ask them about it, they had to open it up, right? They had to have a conversation. They had to share the knowledge. And I was like, and I picked myself up off the ground and was like, that's amazing. That is exactly what this is. Mukadu is a safe keeping place for digital heritage items. It takes that same notion of conversations, of respect, of cultural protocols, and has the technology bend to it. It's not perfect. It's still a piece of software, okay? It's not going to save anything, as I said, right? It's still about people, but at least it respects those protocols, and it gives people a way to manage their digital materials that aligns with their cultural values. So the most important thing is that and when I went to get funding for it, I had to make sure it would be free and open source because we're serving communities that are already marginalized technologically. The heart and soul of Mukadu is this idea of protocols. So that's the number one thing. I went to the engineers because I'm not an engineer, but I've not ever written a line of code, just so you know. But this idea, right? We went to them and said, how do we define these fine-grained levels of access? So there's things like kinship, ritual, gender, family, all of these things so that they can combine. And this internal circulation of content along with its associated knowledges. And that's what the cultural protocols do within Mukadu. So any community can add their cultural protocols. So we worked with communities, Maori communities in New Zealand, and they have iwis instead of tribes. And within those iwis, family and generations are huge. Your genealogy, I don't know if you've ever been to anything with Maori people, but the first hour will just be people singing their genealogy. And I'm not kidding you. I took the Mukadu's director of development, Michael Ashley from Berkeley. We went to New Zealand to give a workshop, and I told him, I was like, don't put anything in the agenda for like the first hour. And then afterwards, he's like, now I know, because there was singing for the first hour. Basically, you stand up and you sing your genealogy. So for them, the genealogy is really important. That's what drives the protocols. In Tennant Creek in Australia, where I work, where the first version of Mukadu was, it was about country. Where are you from? Who's your mother's country, your father's country, where you were? So whatever it is that's important. We work with the Zuni, and they're using clans. Whatever, it doesn't matter is what I'm saying, because you get to decide. You add those protocols to the system, and it works for you. And I'm not going to do too much with the technological end of it, but it is one of the things I made clear to the engineers, as I said, we have a 2-click mantra. Nothing can take more than 2 clicks, because then we'll lose people. And I've held them to that, and I have to say, it's very user-friendly. So I want to show you another example of this. So we're working with the Colville tribe up in Omak, and they wanted to use technology for educational purposes. So we're working with the Pascal Sherman Indian School to create an iPad application that's fully integrated with Mukadu that combines Western science curriculum with traditional knowledge about waterways, specifically the Omak Creek. that runs right behind the Pascal Sherman Indian School. So this is the beta version that we demoed in April of last year up at the school after working for a full year with the teachers and administrators and students. And I have to say, if you haven't been to an elementary school for, even though my kids, I haven't spent a couple days at an elementary school in a long time. If you ever want to be reinvigorated, go to an elementary school for a day. I was like, wow, no wonder you're done at 3. Like, I need a nap. But the iPad application and this notion of bringing together Western science and tribal knowledge works perfectly with the stated mission of the Pascal Sherman Indian School, which is to, quote, prepare our children to be speakers of our language, guardians of our culture, and leaders of our future. What a great mission for a school, right? There's nothing in there about test scores or employment or, anything else. It's, wow, speakers of our language, guardians of our culture, and leaders of our future. And it's a wonderful school with a fantastic group of faculty who have been dedicated. All the teachers we've been working with have been there over 20 years. It's just an amazing place. So we're working with the science teachers at the school right now, creating this blended science curriculum to foster this mission. So, of course, we spent a day at the creek collecting samples, listening to elders talk about the traditional indicators of the creek and the salmon health. So as the students were collecting, various pH and mercury and this and that, the elders were also talking about how they know if the salmon are healthy or not, or why the water's running this way or that. So the students weren't getting one or the other, both at the same time, side by side. So it doesn't seem like one's more important than the other, one's only something we do in November because it's Native American month, right? It's something we do every day. What was really fun is they brought this all back to the classroom. Then they used both hands-on, and you can kind of see the iPads there, to sort, test, and identify Native and Western science terms. They had to work together to put teams, right? So everybody had a role and a responsibility. They had to enter their own metadata. They interviewed each other, interviewed elders. They interviewed the teacher as well as the principal. And as they're working, they can access an English to Salish glossary, and they can listen to Salish terms.
Scratchy.
So as they're looking at these English terms and thinking about that, they can hear the words for water. They can hear the words for salmon. They can go back and listen to them over and over again. The teachers are also, this year we talked about having the kids record each other, right? Because if you're going to hear you need to hear. Here's how it's said by a speaker who knows how to say it. Now you all record it, listen, and go back. So we're creating the curriculum around this, around the needs. So there's lots of examples that I can give, but what these highlight is something that's really important when we want to think about these types of materials that are in archives and libraries. They're not stagnant, they're generative. This was a Salish glossary. Look what it's doing now, right? It's generative of knowledge. So new content is added, new knowledge is being created. So as we focus on engaging communities, we have to engage multiple stakeholders. At the school, it's not just the kids. It's the elders, it's fish and wildlife, it's everybody coming together. So to make digital heritage meaningful, not just digitizing stuff, to make digital heritage meaningful, we need to begin with local priorities, whether they be language revitalization, building science curriculum, or whatever it is. We need to think differently about information, technology, and the social relations that's embedded when we choose to digitize and circulate materials. This is not a value-neutral choice. So it has to stop. We have to stop and think. We cannot, in my estimation, fall back on default notions of openness at any cost. Instead, we need to emphasize connecting with communities, making lasting relationships and records, and ultimately new futures. Thank you.
Where I